Brief introduction from me, our guest speaker, Oliver, some closing comments from Damien, and then a quick Q&A session. Oliver would welcome questions throughout, and at the end he has no hesitation in answering and attending to any heckling if you wanted to do that as well. So before I wanted to get into the event this morning, we obviously operate in the debt collection, credit management space, and we're seeing a number of things in the market. So the customer journey in collection is becoming very important. It's paramount for yourselves and for us. Undoing the bad work of bad collections is really hard to do. Customers have a voice, even more so in today's times. Commercial debt referral rates are increasing, especially in those sectors that are hit hard by the pandemic. You've got tourism, hospitality, and travel. There's a big focus on the total cash collection cycle now. It's not just about making money, it's about getting the money in quickly. So there's two levers there. There's the balance sheet and the profit and loss. Businesses are tending to work both together these days. You need to understand your debtors. Be prepared to adapt and move very quickly should they start to experience any hurt. Because if you're chasing them, chances are someone else is as well. We're all still seeing the poor or recidivist offending payers are still poor payers. They're using the excuse that COVID has become a problem. It's not really the problem. They're always poor payers, so you need to watch them. The IRD, I know I said last time that they've taken off the handbrake. They've come at it more aggressively, and we're seeing more and more liquidations being passed where businesses are failing to meet their obligations or any programmed repayments that they've got in place. So invariably with everything we are seeing in the spaces we operate, obviously we're part of the Waterstone, Gravity Credit and Tempest group of companies. There are a lot of questions around the events of 2020 and what impact that will have going forward. With all the money that's been printed, both here and abroad, our recent budget and the commitments for future expenditure, we're left with the question, what will be the new norm in the post-COVID world? The days are not the same. We get outbreaks, we get changes. There's lots of things that we're not aware of that we're really just, I guess, changing as we need to. It's uncharted waters and we need to be more vigilant. To share some insights from an economic and political perspective, it's time to welcome our guest speaker. He is the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative. It's a public policy think tank in Wellington, working to help and sketch a pathway towards a better New Zealand. Prior to this, he held roles in Australia, the United Kingdom and his homeland Germany. Some of his suggested proposals have been implemented in the UK, and some have caused controversy, even earning him a recommendation from the leader of the opposition at the time that he maybe should leave the UK for Australia. He's here. Welcome, Dr Oliver Hartwich. Thank you.
Of course, in this country you have to start your speeches with a joke or a funny remark, but since you've already commented on German, that said, I have to change my opening joke because recently I've become a New Zealand citizen. Yay! So, and that means I've got no proper opening for my speech. I was asked to talk about the new normal, whatever that might be. So I thought I'd give you a history lesson and reflect on normality and what it actually means historically and what we can expect from the future. That said, I have to be careful giving history lessons. I've learned just on Sunday. I've got an 8-year-old son, and I find it really important that he learns some history. So basically, since he was 5 or 6, I started buying these history books for children. And I read that to him in bed every night, and I try to get him interested in history. And apart from that, I just want to prepare him because he's not going to learn any history at school, of course. And for the history that he is about to learn in the future, he will just learn one aspect of history. So I thought, just to prepare him for that, give him some proper history lessons and read him books. So the latest book arrived on Sunday, and it's called The New Silk Roads. And I started reading to him, and Leo protested and said, not another history book, I know everything about history. He's 8. So anyway, I thought if I try to give you a history lesson today, that might be dangerous. You might have the same response as Leo and say, why is he talking to us about it? We know all of this. So if that's the case, just start heckling me. In any case, what I just wanted to do, I wanted to reflect on where we are, where we've come from, and I think that will hopefully elucidate where we will go. What I would say is that we have had extraordinary stability after World War II by historical standards. For many decades, not that much really happened because we had a very stable confrontation between two belief systems. We had capitalism in the West, we had the Soviet Union and communism in the East, and basically everything kind of worked around this, and it worked actually in this stable manner for decades. And if you were lucky enough to be in the West, of course, things tended to get better over that time. So it was actually a time of great progress, it was a time of stability if you were lucky enough to live in the West. But perhaps I think this stability wasn't quite normal. It's certainly not normal in historical circumstances where things often got a bit rougher. And I just want to reflect just personally on the story of my family, just to illustrate what I mean. I'm afraid this is, of course, all German, but I think if you try to do this thought experiment with your own family histories in New Zealand or wherever you are from or your families are from, you probably figure the same. So my grandparents were born between 1919 and 1922, all in Germany. The first few years, the first few decades really of their lives were terrible, if you think about it. So born right at the end of World War I, where the country was, not quite destroyed after World War I, but in a severe economic crisis. I come from the Ruhr, so the Ruhr in 1923, of course, was occupied by the French because Germany didn't pay the war reparations. So my granddad on my mother's side was 4 when that happened. And then the economic crisis, of course, happened, the global economic crisis. Black Friday, my grandparents were around 10. And my granddad was 14 when Hitler came to power, and he was 20 when the war started. From everything I know, none of my family were involved in the Nazi Party or movement, but that didn't mean much because both my granddads had to serve in the army, of course. They had no choice. One of them in Crete, which I was told was actually a pretty tough theater of war. And then they came back in 45 to a destroyed country. And it was tough again, and I'm still puzzled why they decided to have my parents back in the ruins of the Ruhr, which was heavily bombed. So just put yourself in the position of these people. It was remarkably tough, actually, all of this time until basically your 30s, when suddenly something like stability and economic growth happens, the economic miracle of West Germany. So my grandparents had the first 30, 40 years in poverty, in conflict. In the middle of that, there was a Spanish flu, of course, right at the beginning. So it was quite a difficult life, but the rest of their lives was fine. Democratic, economic growth, economic miracle, first color TV, pretty good. And suddenly they started going on holidays to Italy. This is probably better than trying to conquer other countries going on holiday. But they had a pretty terrible first half of their lives and a pretty good second half of their lives. Now think about our own story. We had a pretty good first half of our lives. I mean, me personally, I was born in 75. I was lucky enough to be born long after the war, so there was no chance I would be drafted into any kind of weird political movement apart from classical liberalism. And I was lucky enough to be born in West Germany, not in East Germany. So I grew up with freedom, with democracy, with economic growth. Then the Berlin Wall fell. Then people like Francis Fukuyama started reflecting on the end of history. I think actually that essay, that book, was probably a bit misunderstood. I don't think he ever really meant it that way. But it was the prevailing mood of the time, that things can only get better. I think there was even a song about it, and Tony Blair took it for his election campaign. So we had a pretty good 30, 40 years, basically. For people like me, born in the 1960s, 70s, it looked good, and it looked as if it could only get better. And especially with the demise of the Soviet Union, the threat of communism, we were optimistic. I mean, the 1990s were probably the most optimistic time that we've had in about a century. And I mean, the 20th century was in other ways quite terrible, of course, for the catastrophes it produced. So the 1990s actually finally looked as if we had found a system that works, that delivers. We believed in globalization, and we believed that everything was only going to get better. What happened afterwards is, of course, that history restarted. So I think history first restarted in the Fukuyama sense in 9/11. It then certainly started again with the GFC. where we actually figured out that ever-growing prosperity may not be a given. And then, of course, we had COVID and all the crises around that, and with the rise of China. So history has definitely restarted. I think Fukuyama would never even dare to publish an essay like that again. So what is normal? I mean, is the first half of the 20th century the kind of historical normal where things are turbulent and not always pleasant? Is it the second half of the 20th century where things looked optimistic and were fine? Or are we just really returning to something that is a bit messier than the circumstances we got used to in the 90s or early 2000s? What is the new normal? So I want to just argue that there is a meta story to all of this. And don't worry, I'll finish on an optimistic note. The meta story is the rise of government, the growth of the state, the insatiable hunger for the state to control our lives and to run every aspect of our lives. It was first described actually by a German economist in the 19th century, Adolf Wagner. Adolf Wagner was a Kathedersozialist, so an academic socialist basically, and he observed the growth of the state, this ever-growing state, the state that never has enough, that always wanted to grow. Well, it was 9% of GDP in Wagner's time. Wagner lived from 1835 to 1917. But he observed something, I think, that has held and that has continued since his time. And it has been analyzed by various economists around the world. I just want to give you a few ideas of why this growth of government has happened and why it keeps happening, why it continues to grow. First, there is an economist called Robert Hicks. Many of you may have heard about him. His most famous book is called Crisis and Leviathan. And Hicks' basic thesis is that whenever there is an economic crisis, or actually any kind of crisis, it could be a war, it could be a pandemic, it could be anything challenging, government will always come to the rescue, offer its services, and basically offer to bail you out and save you, protect you. And that's okay to a degree for government to do that. The problem that Hicks described is just that government will never shrink after the crisis. Well, it shrinks somewhat. It will shrink a little bit, but it will never go back to the level that it was before the crisis. And so what Hicks describes in Crisis and Leviathan is the ratchet effect. So crisis comes, war, First World War, or Spanish flu, or Second World War, or now COVID, and the government will tell you, we're here to fix it. And as we know from Ronald Reagan, the most dangerous words are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Might work for a while, it's a bit of a problem in the long run. I think there is some truth to that, and you can actually see this. It's empirically proven that government does expand in times of crisis and doesn't shrink back afterwards. You can see this in the works of Vito Tanzi. Vito Tanzi, long time with the International Monetary Fund and for a brief period even Deputy Finance Minister in Italy. We hosted him a few years ago actually here in Auckland, and Vito Tanzi and his colleague Ludger Schutnich have demonstrated that quite nicely actually empirically how government grows. By the way, it has grown beyond the imaginations of even left-leaning economists. There's a nice quote from John Maynard Keynes from the 1920s where he describes the growth of government, and he says government has become too big and it should never grow bigger than 25% of GDP. So that was Keynes. So for all the Keynesian disciples today who actually go back to their old master and say this is the justification for the growth of government and more government spending, well, actually their old master, John Maynard Keynes, thought that government at 25% was already excessive. We have then learned why government's growing, and it's been described especially by the public choice school in economics. So people like James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, Menker Olson, they've all described why government grows. And there are so many different theories. There is this log-rolling practice where you try to achieve different political goals at once because it allows you to get different political groups to agree to that and come together. And so they're promoting each other's interests, but the effect is, of course, that government as a whole grows. There's a theory that it's dispersed costs and concentrated benefits that drive the growth of government. So if you are a small industry and you stand to gain a lot from a government policy, well, you lobby the government extensively, but because everybody pays for it, it might just be a few cents per person in the population, nobody will find it worthwhile to fight against that because it's just a few cents. But all the benefits accrue to you, so you have every incentive to hire a PR agency to do the work for you and make sure that you get this. And think about it in the context maybe of an EV scheme. So we have actually had very good explanations for the growth of government from public choice. So the growth of government is empirically demonstrated, it's proven, it's happening. It's been happening for about 150 years, and it's no coincidence that it went along with the development of modern democracy, modern representative democracy. And we, as in economics, we have analyzed to death, really, why this is happening. I still think there is another meta story to the growth of government, and that has something to do with money. And I see we've got Don Brescia, so I look forward to your question. I think the fundamental mistake and the fundamental error was committed in 1971, when Richard Nixon unilaterally moved away from the Bretton Woods Agreement. And for millennia, of course, we had some link of money to precious metals, typically, so gold or silver. The US couldn't afford it any longer at the time of the Vietnam War, and Richard Nixon said, okay, well, we're moving away from that. And ever since, we've been working in this complete fiat money environment where anything goes. And when you combine that with the growth of government as analyzed by the public choice school, you can now see that we have an endless supply of money for all sorts of projects that government would like to do, because there's absolutely nothing limiting it anymore. Before that, of course, government also wanted to grow, and it did grow, as we have seen, but there was still a limiting factor. You still had to pay for the stuff. And that was hard, because you had to tax people, or you had to borrow, and there are limits to both taxing and borrowing. Once you remove the link to gold, to any precious metal, basically anything goes. The government can always come, sorry, the central bank can always come to the government's rescue. And it did. We've seen this. We've seen it under Alan Greenspan with the Greenspan put. When things got rough, the Fed jumped in and saved the economy and saved the government. We have seen it even more clearly, of course, in our current crisis, especially in Europe. We are seeing it in the COVID crisis. But what all of this funny money does is it actually removes money, the monetary system, from the real economy, from the real world. There's no longer any kind of anchor. So we're removing central banks from the real world and let them do what they like. And unfortunately, that gets out of sync with the real world. And the result of that, unfortunately, are economic crises. And they are not unpredictable in principle. And in fact, the Austrian School of Economics, especially Hayek and Mises in their business cycle theory, have predicted that and researched that in the 1920s and 30s. And actually, it was that kind of work that got Friedrich Hayek the Nobel Prize in economics, not his later work on social philosophy. It was actually business cycle theory. So what happens is actually we are creating very cyclical markets, and every crisis is going to be worse than the crisis that preceded it. We've seen it with the stock market crash in '87. We've seen it with the Asia crisis in the 1990s, with the bursting of the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s. We've clearly seen it in the GFC and the Euro crisis. And I just want to give you a bit of a snapshot of what's happening in Europe so you can see where we are headed. Greece, you remember that tiny little country that's always bankrupt? Well, that gave us some sleepless nights about a decade ago, and I wrote about 300 columns about Greece. It's great fun if you're a columnist. Actually, Euro crisis is great fun as a columnist, I can tell you. I really had weekly columns on this for a while. So really 300 columns. You only have to change the country names. You know, one week it's Greece, the next it's Spain, then it's Portugal, it's Italy, and then you can go back to Greece. People never realized I was just copying my own column. Anyway, so Greece, that funny little country at the bottom of Europe, which is existential, of course, for the future and the survival of Europe, if you believe Angela Merkel, and I would never believe Angela Merkel. Greece last week recorded negative yields on its 5-year government bonds. I mean, figure that. That's a country that is 210% indebted, so 210% debt to GDP. Greece would have to produce for more than 2 years and pay everything they produce towards the debt until they'd be debt-free. And this heavily indebted country, which is at the mercy of the European Central Bank, is now actually getting negative yields on its 5-year government borrowings. So you, if you are paying down your mortgage here, pay a higher interest rate than the Greek government, and you're probably less indebted. Something's not quite right there. The other thing that's not quite right, by the way, is that Greece even pays lower yields now than Italy. And Italy is not quite a stable country either. Well, why does this happen? And it's got everything to do with funny money. The thing is, last year, European governments issued close to €1 trillion in new government debt, of course as a response to COVID. Of that €1 trillion of government debt issued last year, the European Central Bank took 95.5% on its books. Actually, for Italy, it took 117% onto its books. So it bought all the debt the Italian government issued last year and some. Why? Because they want to stabilize the Italian government. So Italy, on 10-year bonds, is currently 0.75%. Again, for a country on 155% debt to GDP, this is extraordinarily low. And Italy, about a decade ago, paid about 5-6% on its borrowing, 10-year bonds. So the ECB has come to Italy's rescue. The ECB has come not just to the rescue of the Italian state, because otherwise the state would have long gone bankrupt. It's also come to the rescue of the Italian banking system, because without that, of course, the Italian banking system would have gone bankrupt a long time ago. So basically, if you're interested, let me just summarize it briefly. What happens is the ECB goes to Italian banks and say you can borrow as much as you like at zero interest, and we'll give you all the billions you want, on the condition and the implicit understanding that you will take this money and buy Italian government bonds in a secondary market. And in that way, the Italian banks still get a bit of a difference, an interest difference between the 0% that they pay for them and the 0.75% that they make out of them. So that basically saves the Italian banks, and it also saves the Italian government, because otherwise they could never borrow. So the ECB basically saved both the Italian banking system and the Italian government in one fell swoop. But is it sustainable? And I think, of course, it isn't. Inflation expectations for Europe are now going up to about 4% by the end of the year for Germany. The OCR in Europe is at minus 0.5%. So at some stage, the ECB will have to increase interest rates again and stop the QE program. Well, if that happens, of course, we can see what's happening. So the party is over, and Italy's yields and Greece's yields will rise again at a time when they can least afford it. Because if you have to pay a proper amount of interest again on your 155% debt to GDP for Italy or 210% for Greece, you can see that this is not going to work. You will basically bankrupt economies. You will have a rerun of the European debt crisis. So Europe is quite extreme in that regard. But then again, New Zealand is not that much better. I mean, we have a QE program that's 100 billion, and it will come to an end in June next year. And we can already see what it's doing to our housing market. We can see that it's actually created instability in our economy. Yes, it feels okay. We had some economic growth positive, of course, in the first quarter of this year. But how much of that is real and how much of that is just due to extraordinary monetary circumstances? The other thing that I fear is happening is that we see the increasing merging of fiscal and monetary policy. So we see that the Reserve Bank is now fulfilling functions that previously were in the realm of government. So now they have to take into account what the housing market's doing and house price levels. They have to take into account full employment, full sustainable employment, that's what it's called. But the problem is actually that we have seen an increasingly politicized central bank in New Zealand, but of course worldwide too. You can see it most clearly in a remark we got from one of the central bank officials just a couple of weeks ago, where they reflected on what to do with the inflated balance sheet of the central bank. So they currently have about 87 billion on its balance sheet. That would be more, of course, by the end of the QE program next year, unless they extend it, in which case it will be even more. And they were wondering in public whether they shouldn't just utilize the balance sheet for climate change projects. I mean, for something that was meant to be a monetary policy tool to sustain and stabilize the economy during COVID, this could become basically a quasi-fiscal function. Or actually, sometimes I wonder whether Adrian Orr doesn't want to turn the Reserve Bank into another sovereign wealth fund, because that's where his expertise is, of course. So I think we've got a bit of a problem here. But it fits into the general context of the growth of government. And again, I go back to Hayek. Hayek actually predicted all of this. Hayek said we will never have a free economy and a free society if government keeps the monopoly over money. Because government can distort money, government can create funny money, government can use money, newly created money, for its own purposes. And money then becomes political, when in fact, throughout most of history, it probably wasn't to that degree, because it was still linked to the real world, it was still linked to precious metals. So I think this is the context of our relatively abnormal circumstances that we see today. I mean, COVID, of course, didn't help. COVID accelerated some developments, but I think what we have seen is actually the culmination of a number of developments that have been going for about 150 years. If you take this historical context, it is a development that started with the growth of representative democracy with all of its flaws. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of democracy, I don't see any other better system, but it has its flaws and we have to recognize them. It coincides with a movement away from proper sorts of money towards fiat money and heavily manipulated money. It then leads to the politicization of previously independent central banks. And this is where we are. So what is the new normal going to be in these circumstances? I think our circumstances are dire because our economic order lies in tatters. The kind of economic order that produced so well for the second half of the 20th century is now at risk of becoming totally ossified because of government intervention and monetary intervention. So our circumstances are extremely dire, even though you can't see it right now, because for the moment at least, this cheap money, this funny money, this newly created money kind of all keeps us happy. But it's a bit like a drug addict, you know, you just have the latest injection, you feel high, but then the crash will be even more severe. Then again, I didn't want to depress you completely, so I thought I'd finish on a note of optimism. Because I think even when circumstances are absolutely dire and terrible, there's always hope. And you can always choose. You can always make choices to actually come out of it stronger. The story I want to share with you is a story, a comparison of post-war Britain and post-war Germany. And I find this story incredibly instructive, but also quite encouraging. Because it shows that even when circumstances are dire, you can still make choices that will lead to a better future and perhaps a better new normal. I always found the comparative history of Britain and Germany interesting and fascinating because A, I'm German, and B, I'm an Anglophile. And that's why I also spent some time in London, even though Cameron kicked me out. So picture this, 1945, the war is over. Britain has won. They think they won it. I think it was the Americans, but anyway, they felt that they won the war with a collective national effort. And now they feel in Britain that all of this effort to defeat this evil Hitler Germany would have been in vain if they didn't also create a new Britain coming out of the ashes, quite literally in some places, to really win the peace. And that was the mood of the time in Britain. They wanted to build the New Jerusalem. That was the anthem that the Labour Party in Britain chose at the time for their election campaign. And it's quite extraordinary. So you've got this towering figure, Winston Churchill, who's just defeated evil, and 2 months after the end of the war, he's kicked out of Downing Street by Clem Attlee and the Labour Party. The reason why he's kicked out is because Attlee promised to build that New Jerusalem. And what he promised was also to build that New Jerusalem with exactly the same means by which Britain had defeated Germany. So we all pull together, we use state power, we'll take the whole power of the state and direct it towards this one purpose, to build a new country. A beautiful new country, New Jerusalem. We know how that story ended, of course. It ended in the 1970s. It ended with a 4-day or 3-day working week, with energy rationing, with a winter of discontent, with the dead no longer being buried, with all sorts of chaos, an IMF bailout, and Margaret Thatcher, who then had to clean up the mess. So that was Britain's story. So you took the means of a wartime economy and tried to apply them to a peacetime economy, and you fail within 3 decades. Germany, meanwhile, the complete opposite. A country, of course, where nobody would trust the state anymore after the disaster of National Socialism and Hitler, where the state was discredited morally because of the Holocaust, because of everything else that Hitler had done. So nobody would put any faith in government and the state to run the peacetime economy. Plus the country is, of course, properly in ruins. I mean, if you look at pictures of 1945 Germany, it looks absolutely disastrous. So there's no hope, it would seem. Except the Germans were lucky. They had Ludwig Erhard. And if you haven't come across Ludwig Erhard, Google him, read his biography. He's one of the most fascinating characters you can find in the 20th century. So Erhard was an economist. He was a liberal economist. He was someone who didn't get dirty during the Nazi time and actually kept working in the underground and started developing concepts for the post-war economy and for the post-Hitler economy when that actually endangered his life. If he had been caught with that, he would have probably been executed. And he was linked to some of the people who tried to assassinate Hitler in 1944. So Erhard, for the whole Nazi time, thought about how do we get rid of these guys and what do we do afterwards and how do we create a free Germany again. And in 1945, a US army soldier knocks on his door and says, okay, Mr. Erhard, you have to now run the economy. Because he was clearly not involved in any of these atrocities. So he was put in charge of the Bavarian economy as an administrator, basically, and failed because he wasn't really an administrator, he was an economist. But what happened then afterwards was he was put in charge then of the bi-zones, so the American and British zones, and later then the tri-zone when the French participated in that, so basically all three western parts of Germany. And he was put in charge of monetary reform and of price controls. And Erhard, of course, being a liberal economist, didn't believe in any of this because he believed in the free market economy. He believed that this was the way to create a prosperous new country. And so one day, he abolished price controls. Not just one day, it was a Sunday afternoon because he knew the Americans weren't working. And the Americans didn't like that. The Americans really were in this kind of command and control mode, and they were military. I mean, they were soldiers. I mean, that's what they believed in. Erhard, meanwhile, believed in free markets, and he was an economist. So he abolished price controls on that Sunday afternoon and was summoned to the American General Lucius Clay. And Clay actually said to him, well, didn't you know you were not allowed to alter the prices? And he says, I didn't alter the prices, I abolished the price controls. And then Clay said, but all my advisors are telling me you're making a massive mistake. And he says, Mr. General, all my advisors are telling me exactly the same. And he did it anyway. So he abolished that, he started a new currency. Shop windows filled the next day because suddenly there was a proper currency again, which Germany hadn't had. He instituted a new social market economy, which is not a market economy that had to be made social. It was social because it delivered. That's what Erhard said. And it was based on property rights, on competition, on freedom of contract. So not particularly kind of German inventions, basically Adam Smith applied. And Germany started the post-war economic miracle, which was not really a miracle, it's just what happens when you free an economy and institute a proper market economy. And by the late 1960s, Germany had for the first time in history overtaken British GDP per capita. So Germany worked, Germany became the top export nation in the world, highly productive, low unemployment, out of the ruins, overtaking Britain, the winner of the Second World War. So, what will the new normal be? We've got the choice. We can follow the historical example of Britain and try to run our economy with the state, which is exactly what our current government's, of course, doing. And by the way, for the same reason that Clement Attlee did his policies in the 1940s. Our government thinks it has defeated COVID with a massive national effort, with a team of 5 million. I mean, it sounds very collective already, and it is. So this whole rhetoric about the state doing stuff and protecting us all and running our lives and team of 5 million, and we're all in this together, this is the rhetoric we heard by Clement Attlee. The contrast is, of course, not a belief in any of this nonsense, but a belief in the tried and tested principles of the market economy. And if you want good examples of how this works, look at post-war Germany, look at Ludwig Erhard, look at the reforms he did, or look at your own history, look at the reforms of the 1980s and 90s. If you really want to have a nice summary, read Don Brecht's Hayek lecture, which I recently mentioned in one of my columns, to the Institute of Economic Affairs, delivered in 1996, I believe. There you've got the blueprint of how to save an economy from itself, or actually how to save an economy from an insatiable government. If we institute the basic principles of a market economy, we've got a chance to create our own future, and it will be a better one. It will be a better normal. It will not just be a new normal, it will be a better normal than we have known. If we don't, unfortunately, I think the next crisis is already programmed in. Thank you.
Open the floor for questions, and I'll pick off Oliver. You're talking about interest rates. Is there an argument, I don't know, Scott Sumner and others have made this claim, that the Federal Reserve and other central banks are driving down interest rates, but it's not artificial. What we're seeing is, as we get more old people accumulating capital, and so we have an aging population with lots of old people with money. You contrast that with 1950, where you had a small number of old people, lots of capital. There is an abundance of capital and a shortage of labour, and in that situation, very low and even negative interest rates could make economic sense. Is there any value in that argument, or do you?
I've heard that argument many times. I think Ben Bernanke even used it when he was chair of the Fed. I still don't believe in that. Because even if you think that we have savings glut and that we have a lot of capital kind of sloshing around the economy just trying to find for a harbor, that wouldn't explain why even highly indebted countries like Greece would pay negative interest rates. So I think nobody, even if you're saving for your retirement and you have nowhere to go with your money, you still wouldn't give it to the Greek government and get less for it back in 5 years' time. So I think we see heavily manipulated financial markets, capital markets that have really nothing to do with the fundamentals. So I think you could not think away government intervention and central bank intervention without destroying the kind of interest rates we currently see. So I think there is perhaps some truth to the argument that we are saving a lot for retirement, but then again, this is a Western phenomenon that we're getting older. There are still parts of the world that are actually quite young. So I don't quite buy that. And I think certainly without government intervention, without central bank intervention, we wouldn't be in our interest rates environment, for example, in New Zealand, where we currently are.
Speaking about Europe, what do you think the catalysts are to end this craziness? Is it kind of conceivable that we can perpetuate this craziness for quite some time? Or is there some other constraints out there that will stop it?
Okay, the craziness of Europe has been going on for a long time. So the history of European Monetary Union goes back to first thoughts about it in the late 1960s, and then Luxembourg government formally launched it in the 1970s. It then happened, of course, after the fall of the wall, because Germany giving up the mark was a condition for the French agreement to unification. So this political craziness of monetary union for a continent where monetary union doesn't work because the conditions for an optimum currency area were never fulfilled. That's been around for decades. And that's a clue to how long this might go on, because none of this is built on solid economics. The whole European monetary project is a giant political project. As long as there is political will to sustain it, it will continue. Because you can't explain this with economic tools. If it was for economists, it would have never happened in the first place. So economists can't predict how long this will last. It's entirely a political question. What I would say, just as an observer, if you have zero interest rates in your savings accounts, if actually for many German banks, customers have to pay the bank for holding the money, so they pay a penalty. And if at the same time inflation now goes up to 4% as in consumer price inflation, there will come a time when the political pressures are so great that something needs to be done. I think in the first instance they will try to lift interest rates to a kind of more moderate level, a positive level. If that isn't enough, or if that triggers something, I can't guarantee that it will survive this euro construct. I think the contradictions are so severe within the eurozone that at some stage it will blow up because the political will can no longer be maintained. But it might take another 10, 20 years or longer. It's entirely a question of politics, not economics.
What you know right now, do you support Brexit or not?
I was always a bit torn on the Brexit question. So as an Anglophile, I totally understood why the Brits wanted to leave. Because of all the problems of the European Union and the sad state of the European Union, I can understand if you want to withdraw. As a German, I was always sad to see the Brits leave and leave us with the French. But I say this half jokingly. No, what I mean is, Britain is one of the few countries that actually still has a semblance of kind of free market principles. And the European Union is poorer without Britain in it, because Britain at least held up these principles and it at least claimed to be for free trade, not always in practice. But I think it was nice to have this kind of voice within Europe, and also a country that never really believed deep down in political integration. So having this country in there as a Winston Peters-like handbrake on integration efforts was a good thing. So for these reasons, I was sad when Brexit happened. For all the other reasons, I totally understood why the Brits wanted to leave. And had I been a British voter, I would have voted for Brexit.
You talk about choice, but we have none, because we are most likely having a Labour government for 5 years now. So what does New Zealand look like 5 years from now?
Oh, we'll all drive EVs. We'll cycle across the new bridge. We'll have Adrian Orr run our fiscal policy. The National Party would have long dissolved. No, I don't know, actually. But I'm not that pessimistic. I think, actually, the contradictions of the current approach will become visible very quickly. Basically, once the money runs out, once QE ends, and once the government actually realizes that you can't run the economy like this forever. And I actually wouldn't be surprised if we went into a severe recession in the next 1 or 2 years. And so then it's an open question who will win that next election. So in the meantime, I think what we need to do, we need to tell people that there is a choice. I mean, that's the role of the New Zealand Initiative. We are there to tell people that it doesn't have to be that way. Of course, the media would help with that. We have a bit of a problem there, but we're working on that, and we're fulfilling, in parts, as a think tank, the role of the media as well, getting alternative views out there. But it's difficult to have a proper discussion in this country, because parts of the media are just quick to basically shut you down. I'll give you an example, climate change. We don't believe in broadcast Climate Change Commission and their recommendations because we think they are based on bad economics. We think that there is a much better way to deal with carbon emissions and to lead us to net zero with the emissions trading scheme, because it's working. It's a tried and tested system, and it's working. As soon as you say that, of course, you call it denial, when in fact it's just about the method of how we get there. It's not about whether we should cut emissions. So we just have to explain our position again and again. And I can tell you from experience, I've been in this job here in New Zealand for more than 9 years now. It is tough. It takes a long time until you get ideas through. On climate change, for example, we've been arguing this position now for many years. We've increased our efforts now with the Climate Change Commission, but actually in the last half a year, I noticed that we have turned the debate around a bit, and there are more and more people asking why we can't just rely on the ETS and why it wouldn't work. And I also take it as a compliment that more and more people are attacking us, because that means that they're taking our arguments seriously.
Just following on from your last question, do you think that there's a sentiment in the government and in the population generally that in regard to the business cycle after 2007 and after the COVID pandemic, that we've kind of manipulated our way out of the business cycle theory, and that there is a sentiment in the government that it's able to be controlled?
Yeah, I think the government definitely believes it can control everything. I'm not even sure whether the government would be aware of business cycle theory. They just believe they can just run everything full stop. And no evidence to the contrary can ever convince them of the opposite. It is quite stunning, actually, having failed in, for example, Kiwi Build. They're now trying to do the same with the electrification of the whole economy, which is an infinitely more complicated project than just building 100,000 homes. They couldn't even do that. I mean, yesterday we heard that they invested $1.9 billion in mental health, only to create an extra 5 beds in mental health wards. I mean, how many times do you have to try all of these things until you realize that you can't organize the proverbial piss up in a brewery?
You're going to speak up, John.
Yep.
You talked about traditional, thank you for your talk, I always enjoy your comments. You talked about the traditional monetary economic models, but given that those were developed at times when economies were relatively quarantined and had different factors of production like industries and so forth, are those still valid in the current environment when you've got globally connected economies and technology is such a big value driver? Are we using the right measures and instruments in the current context?
I think the ideas of the monetary system actually have encompassed many different types of economies. But the basic principles have never changed. The basic principle is that you want to keep a monetary system stable, because otherwise you lose your ability to have economic calculations. So no matter what kind of economy you're running, whether it's a service-based economy or goods-based economy, an export economy or whatever else you might try, you still want to retain the ability to calculate properly. Without economic calculation, you simply cannot run anything. So I think the models we're using, the theories we're using are timeless, and they're not linked to a particular set of circumstances. The other thing I'd say is actually, again, you can learn from history. And for example, this fear of deflation, the fear of stable or falling prices, I think it's totally unwarranted. If we look into the most successful time in British economic history, so the rapid expansion in the 19th century, when Britain really ran the world, that was a time of falling prices. The Library of the House of Commons actually analyzed this inflation rates, historic inflation rates for Britain, and found that the lowest inflation rates on average were for the 19th century, where we would nowadays think, well, that would have been a terrible time because there had been constant deflation. How could the economy develop? We've become so used to seeing inflation as this great enemy, deflation as the great enemy we have to fight and be afraid of. But actually look at the most successful time in British history, and it was a time of deflation. I think we should actually study history a bit more, because that would take a fear away of some of these developments. Okay.
Is the OCR sure to rise? And if so, should it be sooner or later?
I think it's way too low as it is. And I think the QE program should have stopped last week. So, I mean, from an economics perspective, I think, I'm not sure how Don Bresch sees this, but I think current circumstances are terrible and wrong. We can see this in the overheating housing market. We can see it in any other asset prices. So I think circumstances do not warrant the state we're in, monetary policy-wise. Whether that will change is a different matter, because I think our Reserve Bank has long moved beyond monetary policy. They're now dealing with everything else, literally. I mean, they started this quest, of course, when they talked about the Maori economy in Tane Mahuta, and now they've given themselves a new logo. Just look it up; it's really beautiful. So ironic, it doesn't always translate. But no, the Reserve Bank is trying to run everything these days. They say they've got a responsibility for the housing market, for economic development, for the Maori economy, for climate change, for diversity, and for everything else. So actually, these unconventional monetary policies, they help them fulfill that wish. We warned of that in a paper 2 years ago when they started thinking about unconventional monetary policy. That was when interest rates were still positive. And we said, well, actually, you're on a really dangerous trajectory here, because once you go into unconventional territory, that allows you to do whatever you like, because you can say or claim that this is needed for monetary circumstances, when in fact what you're really trying to do is something else. And especially at the time, Adrian Orr gave a few interviews where he said, well, the government's not spending enough on infrastructure. So here I am, I'm the governor, I can do that for you, I can just print the money and I can buy these infrastructure bonds if I want to. So it puts him in a position where he can be an activist, and he wants to be an activist. He's made that very clear. So your question whether we should get out of this territory, I mean, from an economics perspective, I think it's relatively clear-cut. Yes, of course we should. From a political perspective and from Adrian Orr's perspective, I mean, he enjoys having all of these tools, and he doesn't want them to be taken away from him. That's the problem I see. I wish that former central bank governors could comment on this.
Do you have any thoughts on the future of fiat currency and whether we need an alternative or if there even is an alternative?
I think it would be desirable to return to some sort of currency with a link in the real world, because otherwise we are only seeing government constructs always at the whim of either a government or a governor like Adrian Orr. So it would be desirable to move to something else. I don't think the alternative, by the way, is Bitcoin, because it's just as artificial as fiat currency. Whether that's politically feasible to move to that system, I doubt. I don't really see the great wish to move to that in a hurry. might be possible after a complete crash of the monetary system, which I wouldn't rule out. But to be clear, I'm not predicting that. But anyway, I don't see this relinking to gold or precious metals coming, except I notice that central banks around the world are increasing their gold reserves, except for the Reserve Bank here, of course, which doesn't have any. So it might be wise to just build up a buffer or some security or some kind of insurance policy for when that happens. In the meantime, what you can also do is, of course, you could just follow Ludwig Erhard's prescriptions, because when Germany was burned with 2 hyperinflations within 50 years in the first half of the 20th century, and Erhard, out of that experience, established a Bundesbank with complete independence and with just one goal: price stability. So it was actually preceding the monetary reforms that New Zealand had, of course, in the 80s and 90s. Germany's had that since 1949, this Bundesbank and this pure focus on price stability. So if you want to, you can invest your political will into that, and you will probably come to a result that is comparable, similar to what you would have had under a gold standard. I mean, just one example, if you have a central bank that does that, the results over time can be quite remarkable. Family history here. My parents loved holidaying in Italy. When they first went in 1970, they had to pay 6 marks to get 1,000 liras. Before the introduction of the euro in 1998, it was 1 mark for 1,000 lira. So that shows you the difference between central banks.
I'll give the last question to myself. If you're pessimistic economically, I guess there's an infinite number of possibilities. But one possibility is a Japanese style, as we've seen the last 30 years, where the central bank there just continues to expand and inflated by equities. Or we have a 2008 or even a 1929 style collapse of the system unraveling. If you were to dust off the crystal ball, what do you think is the more likely of those 2 scenarios, or something entirely different?
The question, which of these scenarios is the more optimistic one? Would you be optimistic to hope that we'll kind of muddle through all of this and we will never face the final day of reckoning and we'll be an eternal Japan for the next decades, where nothing much happens, where economic growth is moderate or non-existent, where the economy is inhabited by zombie firms? Would that be a good outcome? To me, that sounds more like a kind of Dantean scenario, lasciate ogni speranza, leave all hope ye you enter. So it's the purgatory, it's hell, it's where nothing ever happens. I think actually from my optimistic German economic perspective, the crash would be better. I think the crash is the answer, because the crash would finally clear out the mess. And it would give a lot of work to Waterstone insolvency.
Oliver, thank you so much for coming. It's been excellent to have you here. And thank you for all of those who have come here to listen. So Oliver, you're floating on from a series we've had, I think, David Seymour and Bernard Hickey, Bruce Shepherd, Simon Bridges. So I think we've peaked at this point. I don't know how we're going to top Dr. Hartwich going forward. But look, thanks so much for coming. I really enjoyed that speech. I particularly like the references to the Leviathan and the references to public choice. I've become kind of, I've seen in my own experience public choice from both theory and in the application. I don't recommend occupational licensing for obvious reasons. I think that is a direct result of public choice theory in action. We'll be doing at least one more of these before the end of the year, and then we'll have our year in review, which I know some of you would have attended. We do have a little booklet talking about how wonderful gravity credit management is, so please feel free to grab one. And once again, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Oliver. Excellent.